Have I told you about the time that God saved me and my family from a hurricane? All right, so here's how the story goes. Years ago, when I lived full-time in Houston, Texas, because of having a private prayer life and my wife having a close relationship with Jesus, we began to hear God tell us we need to move quickly. Now keep this in mind, we had just renovated our house. We dumped a bunch of money into our dream home. We wanted to spend the rest of our life in it. My wife had just received a promotion as a lawyer for Shell Oil Company, making buco bucks. We just had our first child, so we're getting settled into being parents. And obviously I had my thing going. We were very settled. But all of a sudden, we felt God tell us we needed to get out of there quickly. I remember sitting with my wife at Jason's Deli, having lunch with her, and I remember her telling me and me telling her, we had this urgency in our heart. We're like, is there going to be a nuclear attack on Houston, Texas? Like, what's going to happen? We just knew something was coming, something wasn't right, and we knew that God was telling us to leave. And the only reason we're able to hear that was because we had been seeking Jesus. We had a personal, private prayer life, and we both were hearing from the Lord. So we did just that. We sold everything we owned. We sold our house. We sold all our furniture and everything, and we moved out to Pagosa Springs, Colorado. 6 weeks after we landed in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, Hurricane Harvey destroyed the house we had just sold in Houston, Texas. I mean, it was underwater, like 8 feet of water, for a couple of weeks straight. They had to tear the house down. The house is completely gone to this day. It doesn't exist anymore. And so we think about God's deliverance in that situation. Every time I think about that, it just stirs me up. I remember it so clearly. And it reminds me, not only did I hear from God, but I remember how he spoke to me and how he obeyed and how he delivered us from the hurricane. And it stirs my faith. It grows my faith. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. Amos, the book of Amos in the Bible, chapter 2. You can read verses 6 to 8, and it's pretty scary. It's basically God saying, I am going to pour out my wrath and my judgment, and I am going to clobber you with it. And he's speaking to the people of God. And it talks about the things they have done to upset him and why his wrath will be poured out. And then if you go to chapter 2, verses 9 to 11, it tells you exactly what happened. The people of God forgot about what God had done in the past for them. The people of God had forgotten God's faithfulness and what he had done in their lives. And we see that same story played out when the people of Israel, the people of God, are delivered from Egypt, from Pharaoh. Not only were they went from slavery to being given wealth from Egypt and given the ability to escape from Egypt, from their masters. But then God parted the sea and destroyed the Egyptian army and the Pharaoh. And here they are wandering around in the desert as they're going to enter into this beautiful promised land that God had told them they were going to get. But they forgot what God had done in Egypt. They forgot what God had done in the past, right? So what happens? They never get to the promised land in that generation. God just makes them wander around in the desert because they forgot about God. Their faith was waning and struggling because they forgot about what God had done in the past. And you look at the Psalms in the Bible. Why does David have so much success? It says over and over again that God made him victorious. God gave him all of the power in the land. God lavished him, and we see this in 2 Samuel, right? God lavished him with victory and honor and glory and allowed him to lead. He was the greatest leader of that time. And he defeated all of his enemies. And you see the favor of God on him. And what is it that we notice in the Psalms? David never forgot what God had done in the past. Okay? He had never forgotten. And so because he'd never forgotten how good God is and what God had done in the past, his faith was always stirred. He was always full of faith. And he lived in obedience to God. He continued to seek God with all of his heart. He was known as the man after God's heart. And so we see that again and again throughout Scripture. So what is faith? Right? Well, we actually have a definition for faith in the Bible. It's in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. We know that says faith is the reality of what is hoped for. It's the proof of what is not seen. Okay? It is the reality of what is hoped for. It is the proof of what is not seen. So we know that we can see the effects of wind. We can feel it, hear it, see what it does. But we can't actually see wind. So our faith is something we can't see. Right? It's invisible. But we can see the effects of our faith. We could see and remember that when we had faith, God did A, B, and C. We can remember all the things that God has done in our life. And that reminds us right here and right now that God is faithful, that He's real, that we can rely on Him, that He's trustworthy, and that we should listen and obey Him and seek Him. And as a result, our future is secure. Now, whether we get the promise of treasures and glory and esteem and victory and all of those things in this life or in heaven, it doesn't matter. What we know is that the promise is true and we can trust God that He's going to bring us into it. Now, you can choose to wander around in the desert your whole life and not receive that favor and that promise, or you could be like David, right? And you'll stand a chance of receiving some of that favor and some of that responsibility of being in the promised land in this life. And the difference between the two is your faith. I mean, you look at the thing that frustrated Jesus the most, right? There's a lot of things that frustrated Jesus, but He was constantly frustrated with His disciples. Why? He says, man, how much longer do I have to be with you, people of little faith? When Peter sunk, when he was walking on the water in the middle of the night, what did Jesus say after Peter sunk in the water? He looked at him, he shook his head, he said, why did you doubt? Okay? So my challenge for you this week is I want you to practice growing your faith. Okay? And here's how we grow our faith. You can read in Hebrews chapter 11, read the whole thing, and it's going to list situation after situation after scenario after scenario after example of times throughout history where God was utterly faithful to His people. And that's how we can stir our faith. That's how we can grow our faith, is by reading the Bible and being reminded that if we truly believe the Bible, and I believe every single word of it, that God did indeed part the sea, that God did indeed deliver Israel from the Egyptians. Every single thing that we can think of that's miraculous in the Bible really happened. Jesus really put His hand on somebody, multiple people, and raised them from the dead. He literally healed blind people. If we look at the favor that He had on David, let those memories in Scripture, let those historical documentations and recordings allow your faith to be stirred, that that's the God we serve. The second thing I'm going to challenge you to do this week is let your own testimony stir and grow your faith. So I want you to actually take out a piece of paper and a pen, and I want you to write down 3 things, at least. If you want to have some extra credit, write as many as you can come up with. But write at least 3 things that you can remember that God has done in your life, where you knew, in that moment, you knew that you knew that you knew, right? That God moved. Okay? So I can think about how God rescued me from Hurricane Harvey. I could think about the time God told me that He was going to give us a sum of money that would allow us to do a certain thing in ministry. And literally He gave us that money to the dollar. I could tell you story after story of how God has blessed our life and given us answers to prayer. And we've seen His hand working in our lives. And if I write down all those things and I remember them and think about them and meditate on them and get excited about them, get pumped about them, immediately my faith is full. And so when I encounter that obstacle that stands before me today or tomorrow, my faith is full, and I can go into that scenario and I could seek God in that scenario, trust God in that scenario, and live by faith in that scenario. So that's my challenge for you this week, fellas. Think about the faithfulness of God in Scripture. Think about the sovereignty of God in Scripture, the power of God in Scripture, and think about the times in your life when God has moved mightily, that you have no doubt in your mind whatsoever that He did it. It was Him, and He's good, and He loves you. And allow that to stir your faith, right? And let's live in that faith. Have a good one.